I can do that.
Test, are you guys there?
Yep. Can you hear us?
Okay. Yeah, we can hear you. Sorry, this is Scott, technical support. All right, Laura, I got it going here.
Good to have you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Good morning. Hang on.
So Scott, I think that they actually started the broadcast.
Yeah, I know that sounded like it.
Yeah, so
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
we can hear you.
Oh, thank goodness. That was only mildly stressful.
Laura, we're not sure.
Sorry.
We think they may have started the broadcast. I don't know that anybody else is on yet.
No,
But
it's not recording.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning for our webinar on navigating and managing working in the remote or hybrid environment. This is a topic that is near and dear to all of us, not only presently, but for the past 6 months. And we're really lucky that we have David Galvin, who is the Senior Director of Operations and HR for Coastal Community Foundation, and Scott Olson, who is a partner with Social Venture Partners Charleston, as well as a retired partner with lots of experience in this field. So both of them will share their expertise with you guys today on topics within this general category that we all seem to be navigating and managing, some days better than others for all of us. Today being one of those for me that was a little touch and go at the beginning on the tech side. So probably not a time that I missed David Galvin more than at about 9:15 this morning. So again, I'd like to thank Scott and David for being with us this morning, and Dominion Energy for sponsoring the LEAD program so that nonprofit leaders like yourselves can learn, engage, advance, and deliver. A few housekeeping points. Scott's going to introduce topics and give a little bit of information on each of the topics. David will then share his relevant experience and expertise from what the foundation is doing now and what he is hearing from his colleagues in the field. And then there'll be time for you guys to ask questions. You can do so through the question box. And at the end, there will be a survey. Please take the time to complete the survey. It's really brief, really quick, and it's essential for us to be able to continue to offer programs like this that you guys all want. So without any more time from me, I will turn it over to Scott Olson. Thank you, Scott.
thanks, Laura, and it's great to be here with you all and to present with David on it. I think, as Laura pointed out, a subject that really hits all of us in one way or another, as leaders of organizations as well as just as team members of organizations. I was struck by a survey that came out by my former firm, PwC, a pulse survey of chief human resource officers that was released within the last couple of days. And this is for Fortune 1000 type companies. And they listed that the 3 biggest concerns they have about their workforce performance was, number 1, employee anxiety and burnout. Number 2, lack of tools to accelerate collaboration and creativity. And number 3, a weakened culture in a virtual world. So I think the issues that are being faced by a lot of the nonprofits, not surprisingly, are the same things that are being faced by some of the biggest organizations in the world. So I guess if you say misery loves company, that's not necessarily a reassuring thing, but it is reassuring to know that this is a challenge for everybody in terms of how to manage work and life and culture and productivity in a remote environment. The other thing I would mention is that many of the strategies that we'll be talking about and many of the issues we'll be talking about that have been employed for remote working are just as applicable whatever the new normal is. And we've heard that many organizations are thinking about a hybrid work environment. Some are delaying returning to an office environment almost indefinitely. And so no matter where your organization is going in terms of your work environment and your work style, some of these issues are pretty prevalent no matter which approach you take going forward. And consistency in approach, along with flexibility, and those sound like contradictory concepts, but consistency in terms of how you treat people and flexibility in terms of what kind of work style you have are probably going to be watchwords for the future, no matter where we go with the pandemic. So we had a couple of general categories that we thought we'd try and cover as we go through this. And the first one, which I think we all struggle with a little bit, is this notion of managing yourself, setting boundaries between work and life in a remote environment. And one of the things that I noticed, there are a lot of organizations that have used remote work strategies for many, many years. And for many nonprofits and many other organizations post-COVID, this was really something that was thrust upon you without any warning. But it is useful to find out what kinds of things people found valuable about remote working and what kind of challenges team members felt with remote working for those that have been doing it for a while. And not surprisingly, one of the big benefits that people have found are things like flexibility, a shorter commute, ability to spend more time and address family and personal issues. And the challenges, as we might expect, are things like not being able to unplug, a sense of loneliness or lack of connectivity, and distractions from home. So I think we've all experienced that in terms of not just managing your own work-life balance, but that of your children, your spouse, your partner, whomever. So this comes with some pluses and minuses, but the question here we wanted to get to was how to set those boundaries and some strategies you might be able to employ in order to manage that work-life balance. So the first thing, and this will go through a number of the topics we've covered, is to recognize that work is becoming more task-oriented rather than hours-oriented. Some of you may be dealing with working a little bit in the morning, then getting your kids off to school or doing some homeschooling with them, then doing another block of work in the middle of the day, and then maybe even doing work after your normal hours because you've had these other interruptions that take place during the day. And so the focus really is not 9 to 5, but it's, did I get done during the day what I needed to get done for my teammates, for my leaders, etc. And one of the things that we've seen people think about is keeping some kind of an informal log. And some organizations, in fact, we were doing a session with a couple of local nonprofits last week. Some organizations are not necessarily going to timesheets, but are really asking employees to kind of log their hours in informally. And part of that is to make sure that workload balance is fair, so that some people are not now finding that they're working 50 or 55 hours a week instead of 40. But some of it's also just to understand how you're using your time and making sure that work is not creeping too much into your regular life. Another thing that we found is, while not commuting is great, and I think everybody enjoys that time, commuting did serve a little bit of a purpose in that it created separation. Most of us have some rituals that we might take between the home and the office, listening to the radio, or finding a way to unwind, or listening to a podcast. When you're working from home, those rituals somehow go away. And so replacing them with something that says, okay, I'm ready to start my work part of my life, and I'm going to do X, Y, or Z, can be a helpful ritual or a helpful process to get that separation. Another one, scheduling breaks. We all used to get up and walk around, maybe to get a cup of coffee or go to the quote unquote water cooler. And you ended up getting up and walking around and probably seeing people. So scheduling some breaks in your day, even to go outside and take a walk around your house or your apartment complex, wherever that might be. But actually scheduling that, because it's very easy to just sit at the table or the desk and work without any kind of a break. Another one we were just describing was managing your Wi-Fi and your connectivity. I know that before I got on this webcast, I got and turned off all my apps so that I had as much streaming capability as possible, and trying to coordinate with family members depending on what kind of Wi-Fi you've got and whether you're maximizing that capacity. And the final one I'll mention is just creating a work environment. So I know it's great to be able to hang out in our athleisure when we're working from home, but even having a different outfit for work versus when you're not working creates a little bit of separation. If your workspace is in a common area of your house, think about covering it up so you don't see it when you're not working. If you have a dedicated office, that's great. You can close the door and you can go back to your work, to your life, to your regular life. But that notion of an environmental change, whether it's clothing, workspace, creates a little bit of a different attitude. So let me pause there. David, some of these things may sound familiar to you, and you may have heard from your colleagues at CCF some different strategies that people are employing. Let me go to you and see what you'd like to add on this particular subject.
Sure. Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you for inviting me, Laura. And I'm excited to learn from Scott and to also share a little bit about what Coastal Community Foundation has done and how we've navigated these challenges during the pandemic. Here at CCF, we have a remote office in Beaufort, and we have affiliates in Murrells Inlet and Pawleys Island. So we've managed remote workers before, and everyone's had to telecommute during inclement weather and at other points, but we've certainly never worked remotely for an extended period of time. So this has been new to us as well. And Scott, so many of the things that you've just brought up have been challenges that I've heard from staff, particularly trying to separate those boundaries and not work all the time, not feel like they're working nights and weekends, and how do they make that separation. You're right about physical separation. If you can have a particular desk that's dedicated to work, that's great. If you can have a corner of a room, a little table that you can dedicate, rather than trying to work off the kitchen table, because if you're working from the kitchen, then it just kind of blends everything together. As much as possible, we encourage staff to work a regular schedule and then quit at the same time they used to back at the office, but that's not always possible. So in those cases, you're right, Scott. It's really more about the work that's produced rather than just focusing on the hours. And personally, I do keep a journal. It's not really a time journal, but every day I kind of record what I do and the projects that I've completed, or at least work toward completing every day. And that helps me stay motivated. Also, as you've indicated, making sure that family and friends are aware that if you're at work, if you're at home, but you're focused on work, that it is work time and you're off limits. And one thing that I think leaders can do to prevent staff from working all the time or feeling like they have to always be available, especially now, is either not sending emails at night or on weekends, or if they do feel the need to send an email, when they're thinking of it, to just let staff know that it's something they can respond to the next business day, and they don't have to provide an immediate response on a Saturday or Sunday or late at night. So those are some of the thoughts that I had and some of the things that we'd heard here, Scott.
No, I think that's a great one, that last one. It's important throughout our discussion today is to make sure that as work styles change, that leaders mirror the behaviors that they're asking their staff to do. And I saw a great email signature. I think a lot of people have an email signature that says, please excuse typos because this is from my iPhone, or different things that they put on there. But I saw one recently where the person said, my work hours may be different from yours. Please don't feel the need to respond to this email immediately, right? So that gives that level of permission. Now, obviously, if you've got something that does need to be addressed quickly, you can put that in the body of the email, but giving permission for people to understand that work hours can be different for different people, particularly in a remote environment, could be a really good strategy to employ. Well, let's move on to another set of topics. So more around managing yourself and others in a remote or hybrid environment. All right, we've talked about separation. We've talked about the need to be mindful of your work life versus your personal life. But that does have implications for how you do your work and how you interact with colleagues, and quite frankly, some concerns that organizations have about productivity when you don't have that opportunity for face-to-face interaction on a daily basis. So one of the things that has become a big topic is a notion of check-ins. So these are scheduled discussions between team members, some cases between a manager or a leader and members of their team, and even with peers, to be able to know that what people are doing, checking in on how they're doing as much as what they're doing. And I think a lot of organizations have put this in place of doing check-ins on a regular basis with across teams and with their team members. I've heard from some organizations that seemed to have a limited useful life, that they became sort of routine and they really didn't learn much from them. So this is an area where the check-ins are important, but the format and the level of formality or informality that exists with them may need to change a little bit. So if you're blocking out 15 minutes a week for a check-in with each person, if you only need 5 minutes, then that's fine. And it's great to go off then, and maybe everybody can take a 5-minute break, or you can go off and actually do some work instead of being in a check-in. The other thing I've heard in many cases is that with these formal check-ins, you lose some of the personal interaction that you have in an office setting. And so it's important to make sure some of those check-ins, as I mentioned before, are about how are you doing as much as it is what are you doing. But I think maintaining those check-ins is going to be important, whether you end up in a hybrid environment, a telecommuting environment, as David described, or even in a totally virtual world. The second category is transparency. And I think that's probably the most important trait that we've heard as organizations may move between task and hour-based work and accomplishment. And that comes in many forms. One is calendars, right? So we do know that people have availability issues, and it's important to let your team members know when you're not available because of a family issue or personal issue that you've got. Just like when you were in the office saying, hey, I'm going to need to leave a couple hours early today because I've got to deal with a broken down car, or I've got a meeting with my child's school. It's just as important to make people aware of that in some kind of a virtual calendar or in some kind of a communication, so that people know when you're going to be working and when you're not, if you're not working a normal 9-to-5 day. The other thing is thinking about batching meetings. I think we all recognize there's a lot of meeting fatigue going on right now, and in some cases that leaves little time and blocks of time to actually block out time to actually do the work that you're supposed to be doing. So thinking about calendaring around individual schedules and also making sure there's not overlap. Even things as simple as making sure that if there are a couple of meetings that run back to back, that there's a 5 or a 10-minute break in there so people can, do the bio break or grab a cup of coffee or take that walk around their house or walk around the room to get up out of the seat. Another area of transparency is around goals and objectives. In many cases, team members may be working on things where others are relying on them getting something done before they can move on to the task. So while it's great that you might be doing some work between, because you have to, between 8 and 8:30 at night, instead of between 3 and 3:30 in the afternoon, that's not okay if somebody is waiting for that work to be done so that they can do what they need to do between 4 and 5 in the afternoon, and now they've got to wait until 9 o'clock to be able to do that. So being transparent about what am I working on and when do I think I'm going to be able to get that done, and avoiding bottlenecks for teams is really important. And it's interesting to note there are obviously a lot of new technology tools out there in terms of calendaring, in terms of project management, Microsoft Teams has a new suite of tools that's become pretty popular and allows you to do some of these things, but there are a lot of other providers. There's a calendaring app called Calendly. There's another task-oriented app. So there's a lot of different tools that can be used. And again, these are things that probably would be just as useful in a back to the office environment as they are in a remote environment. Another area of transparency is access to leaders. Because we're constantly focused on tasks and focused on meetings and Zoom meetings and things, it can be awkward to find time to just ask questions and have access to your manager or your leader. One of the things I found interesting that some organizations have borrowed from academia is the notion of having office hours, of saying, hey, on Tuesdays between 2 and 3 p.m., I'm going to block my calendar so I'm just available to talk to folks and address issues that may be coming up or answer questions. That's increasingly important as you move potentially into a hybrid work environment, to make sure that the folks that are in the office that you can just walk into their manager's office and sit down with them don't have more access than the folks that are telecommuting. And so office hours can provide that notion of consistent access to leaders across different types of team members. Next thing we've heard in many cases is how you assign tasks. And it's sort of not maybe obvious, but when you have a face-to-face discussion about a project or about a piece of work that needs to be done, there's a level of commitment that comes from that face-to-face interaction. I'm asking you to do X, Y, and Z. I'm agreeing to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm kind of explaining to you how that fits into the other work that I need to do. Contrast that with being able to just toss off an email and say, I need this done by 5 o'clock today. And all of a sudden those things start to pile up and they become very impersonal. It also means that some people may be getting more tasks than others because you're just used to sending that email off or that text off to one person or another. And so keeping the personalization and the commitment around assigning tasks is something that we've heard has been a challenge in a remote environment because of the impersonality of it. Another thing is thinking about special projects. In the software development world, there's a notion of things they call bursts or sprints, where they bring together different, maybe in some cases, cross-team groups to do things very quickly. And using a remote environment, maybe bringing people together off-site, at a coffee shop, or even using your office when you don't have the entire workforce in there, but you could easily accommodate 3 or 4 people to come in there. And doing these sort of bursts or sprints as opposed to your traditional project management is something that we've heard remote working can help with. And then the final thing, obviously, as you adapt to a remote work environment or maybe a hybrid work environment, is this notion of needing to update your employee policy guides and manuals, right? It's easy in a 9-to-5 office-only environment that you have certain policy guides, whether it's dress codes or on-time policies or different things. How does that shift? And are there things that you need to do to update when you have a remote work environment? And I know there's a number of nonprofits that have been working on that. It's going to be a topic that we'll come back to when we talk about onboarding and hiring, that if you don't have the policies in place and the guidance in place, it's a lot harder to keep that culture when you have to manage a remote work environment. So with that sort of overview and a couple of different strategies, David, let me turn it back over to you and put the CCF lens on this in terms of how you've been handling some of these things within the foundation.
Sure. Well, there's so much here, Scott. We could talk just about this topic for the rest of the hour. But you mentioned Microsoft Teams, and we've been using that. We were using Microsoft Teams before the pandemic, but it's just been such a great tool that we've really started utilizing all of the project management aspects of it, and also the instant messaging. It's great to be able to just reach out and have a live conversation with a team member, particularly if it's something you're going back and forth with and you just have a couple of quick questions back and forth rather than sending an email and waiting for the response and responding back to that. You can go back and forth for 20 minutes when using Teams, instant messaging, or Slack or something similar, you can resolve it in 2 minutes. So it's really a great tool. And one challenge that we've had with managing remote workers in some cases is, we don't have those impromptu hallway conversations. And so when we're communicating assignments, managers really have to be specific and clear on what the deadlines are. So if someone needs to have something done by Friday at 5, the email needs to say that rather than, could you just work on this? One other point, Darren Goss, our president and CEO, has really encouraged everyone to use PTO. We found that usage of PTO has gone down over the past few months, and people can't travel as much, so they're not as inclined to take PTO. But even if you're not going anywhere, you've earned the PTO and you should take it. You don't necessarily have to fly somewhere. You can take a staycation. And some of our staff said, well, I don't need a staycation, but the reality is it is so helpful to be able to log off and not focus on work. And we all need that time to step away. It doesn't have to be a week at a time. You can just take a long weekend, and leaders can model this. And again, Darren has encouraged everyone to use their PTO, even if you don't have a place to travel to. And those are really just some of the things that we've encountered here, Scott. Laura, do we have any questions?
We do have one question, which is, do you have a recommendation as to the best platform for a check-in? So I'm thinking that means phone versus video.
Yeah, that's I think a good question. I'd be interested, David, how you guys have done this. But one of the things that we'll get to as we talk more broadly about communication is this whole notion of screen fatigue. It's not a term I ever heard before, but we've heard it in the last 6 months. And as people have gone to being on their screen all the time, perhaps working out on the screen and then streaming television shows on their screen, you're really never away from it. And so check-ins can be useful. I think as Zoom became, or GoToMeeting, or any of the different platforms became much more useful, we've migrated toward it, and somehow now we do everything there. But sometimes, a conference call is okay. And maybe you can do a conference call while you're out walking around in your neighborhood, as opposed to being on a screen and feeling like you're always tied to the desk. So depending on the format and the content of a check-in, I think it's useful to be selective and be flexible about format. But again, David, I'd be interested to hear what you guys have been doing on those things.
Well, we've really done all of the above, Scott. Some managers like FaceTime, actually, and they'll just FaceTime their staff member. Some others have used GoToMeeting or Zoom, and also Microsoft Teams has that video capability, so they've used that. But also just having a phone conversation, and just, if you have a phone call, you can walk outside and kind of take a little exercise break at the same time you're having the check-in. So we've used all the tools, but I think it is great, as you've indicated, to try to get away from the screen as much as possible, because since we're not having the in-person conversations, we're just glued to the screen all day.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. Okay, we'll keep moving here, and I did mention a moment ago that we would talk a little bit about broader communication strategies. Again, a big change for organizations and leaders in particular that are used to being able to have a lot of face-to-face contact with people. There's obviously differences between remote communication and in-person communication. Video or otherwise, they are just different. One of the funny things that I've noticed being on a lot of Zoom calls, as opposed to sitting in a conference room, when you're in a conference room, you're looking at everybody else. I don't know about you all, but when I'm on a Zoom call or a GoToMeeting call, I'm sometimes looking at myself as well to make sure that I look like I'm paying attention and engaged and all of those things. That was not something that we had before. So there's just nuances between in person and even video conversations and communications that that are difficult to overcome. And I think that's one important difference, is we've kind of migrated from conversations that take place in the office to communications that take place remotely. And the question becomes, how do you maintain that conversational aspect of how you interact with team members, how you interact with leaders and others? So a couple things that that we've heard people using. First of all, build in that personal meeting agenda to your meetings. Again, if you have a conference room, oftentimes people will gather a couple minutes before or before the meeting starts, and there's an opportunity for one-on-one conversations or small group conversations before the meeting begins. That doesn't happen on a Zoom call. And so dedicating some time in those meeting agendas for things like celebrations. And what I mean by celebrations isn't just birthdays and work anniversaries, but also, hey, celebrating, gee, we accomplished X, Y, and Z last week, and isn't that great? As an organization, we were able to do this. So everything doesn't have to be task focused, but there's an important personal aspect to meeting agendas. The other thing I've heard people raise is that remote meetings, oftentimes people can sort of opt out of, that it's harder for folks to participate and harder for folks to remain engaged. And so one of the things that we've seen organizations do is have the leader of the meeting, there could be a set agenda, but have different people facilitate that agenda. Wouldn't mean that different people speak or different people don't have responsibility for the agenda items, but you have a different, master of ceremony, so to speak, so that people have an opportunity to play that role. Particularly with junior staff or with newer staff that are new to your organization, find a way to include them in an agenda. Maybe simply talking about what were the things that they were working on or accomplished that they can share with the group. It also allows you to have some cross-team interaction, which becomes harder in a remote environment where you're sometimes just focused on the people that you're working with and not really aware of what's going on elsewhere in the organization. So having maybe a different department feature a team member and talk about some of the things that they're doing can be a way to create that culture and that interpersonal interaction. Sometimes using technology substitutes for informal interactions, right? I used to maybe pop my head into someone's office, but now what I might do is just send them a quick text, right? There's a difference between a text and a phone call. It just might be, hey, how are you doing? Or, hey, I know you were out last week because of a medical issue. How are things going? Those sort of unscheduled calls or text is a way to keep informal interaction together. And the other thing is offsite get-togethers, right? If you have to meet with somebody, you're not in the office, maybe you can meet at a coffee shop or you can meet in a park and have an opportunity to communicate with one another beyond just the task-oriented side of it. Might add some extra time to this, but it does allow you to use different environments. We talked about meeting formats. There's a place for video, but it may not be all the time, even though it's become, a really valuable tool in communication. But the old-fashioned conference call still exists and it has its time and place. Be opportunistic with face-to-face interactions. If you are in the office, make sure you're actually interacting with people face-to-face. I had an old rule because we had people virtually all over the country. If we were in the office together, I didn't want to get an email from someone. I wanted us to talk and sit down. So when you are in the office, make sure you're making use of the office and not just working remotely in the office. There's no point to doing that. And then for leaders in particular, I've heard this notion of increased frequency, formats, and I put it in quotes here, but volume of communication. Communication in a remote environment is that much more important. And it's very difficult when you're on a conference call or when you're on a Zoom meeting to really understand how people are responding to your message. So I'm seeing things like videos, so that short videos, so that people can be connected. Even if they can't be in the meeting, they can see the messaging coming from a leader. That could be a different format that you use. updates on how's the organization doing. Again, that notion of celebration. What have we accomplished? Anything that you can do to kind of keep in front of people, recognizing that people respond to different formats in different ways, is a way to kind of develop more effective communication as a leader for your organization. Again, a lot of subtleties and nuance here, a lot of things that you can learn from remote working that you can probably apply as you move back into an office or a hybrid environment. And again, I'll pause there, David, and again, get your thoughts on some of the things that you all have been doing in terms of communication strategies.
And I'm learning from you as we're going along, Scott. This is great information. And one thing I would say about meetings, you mentioned earlier that there are too many meetings in some cases, but prior to the pandemic, we had a staff meeting just once a month, and it was usually up to 2 hours. And since March, Darren, our CEO, has moved to weekly all staff meetings, and they're just short meetings. They're 30 minutes every Monday. And it's really been a great way for the team to connect, all staff to connect, because we have over 35 team members if we're including our affiliates. And so we don't always have an opportunity to interact with everyone, and certainly we don't always interact with Darren as part of our daily work. So rather than going a month to interact with some staff members, we do have those 30-minute check-ins, and those have really been effective. And even during those staff meetings, Darren and the leadership team have taken the opportunity to create space for staff to share on a personal level. It's not required, but he does open up the floor for staff members who wish to share any issues that they're going through so that the rest of the team can be aware. But it is so critical to take the time to check in and find out how people are doing physically and emotionally so that we can be aware of their challenges and help them in any way that we can. And as far as team meetings, most departments here have weekly team meetings, and then most managers do one-on-one check-ins with everyone. And just going back to an earlier topic, I failed to mention, Scott, you made a good point about kind of customizing the length of the check-in depending on the team member. If it's someone who has like a data entry role and they're kind of doing the same types of things every week, they may not have a lot to report out. On the other hand, if it's a program director, that's going to require a longer check-in. So if you have different people with different roles reporting to you, you don't have to necessarily book an hour every week for each one of them. One of the things that we've done too, and we were doing this prior to the pandemic, but we have everyone take the Everything DISC workplace profile, and many of you probably heard of DISC profiles. This one is focused specifically on the workplace and work styles, and it really helps us understand how our colleagues work and how they like to communicate, and it's really been great to help us understand. So when we bring on new team members, we have them take the assessment so that we can understand their workplace style and their communication style. And I would point out also regarding meetings that some team members may be quieter. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not engaged. Sometimes they just have to take time to process. And that's one thing that the DISC profile has helped us understand. So those are some of the ways that we've communicated with staff. Scott.
No, those are great. Sorry, Laura.
I'd say it's probably a good place to remind everyone that if they have questions, they can put them in the question box or the chat box, because certainly Scott and David have much to share, and they don't want to necessarily be up there giving a monologue. They want to hear from you guys. So feel free to ask questions throughout, and we will certainly make sure that we have time to answer them during and after the webinar as well. That's it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think questions or experiences people have had, and it reminds me of two things. That notion, and I thought, David, you mentioned a great point about moving towards some weekly staff meetings. You may never have done that without the need in a COVID environment to do it, but it may be something that you decide to keep going after this all ends, because you've seen some real big benefits to it. And I do think there are some silver linings to having lived through remote working that organizations are finding and saying, hey, we didn't have to do this now, but gee, there's been some real value in it. Number two, this notion of having the opportunity to share, whether it's in a small group or a larger group, just having the opportunity to kind of say, yeah, how are you doing? How are you coping with remote working, and understanding, number one, that others are having the same challenges that you're having, or people may be able to share little tips and things that they're doing that other team members would benefit from. So there are some silver linings that come from some of the requirements that we've had to deal with remote working. But I love the idea of that increased interaction with your leadership through those meetings, which has been kind of a positive that's come out of this, and probably helped to strengthen that notion of your culture a little bit.
Scott, we do have a question.
Great.
David, it's a question for you. What is the workplace style profile you're talking about, and can you share or provide a link to such a tool?
Sure, it's through Wiley Publishers. It's called the Everything Disc Profile. We work with a consultant, Tan Davis Consulting. She's in the upstate, and I can certainly provide her contact information.
Great. There's a second question as well, which is about virtual interviewing. Do you want me to ask that now, or do you want to wait till we get to that portion of the webinar?
Let's hold off
Why
on
don't we
that.
hold it just so that we can go through some things and then see how the question relates to some of the experiences we've had.
Okay. So answer is coming regarding virtual interviews.
Cool.
Thank you.
So before we get to interviewing, we wanted to talk a little bit about the potential for virtual performance reviews. And some of you are already doing that in terms of these check-ins. There's a certain aspect of performance review that goes into check-ins. But we all know that performance reviews are a difficult and controversial topic. There's never been a perfect approach to performance reviews. And doing it virtually just makes it that much more difficult. And quite frankly, doing it during a pandemic, where, as we said, one of the biggest challenges that leaders are facing with their workforce is around anxiety. So a couple of tips that I've picked up in terms of research and reading is number one, to remember in a performance review to always focus on the purpose. What are you trying to achieve? And some subtopics there: have performance criteria changed post-COVID? Right? Do you have other things that you need to focus on in terms of team members' performance? And do you include it in any way, again, both from their perspective as well as from the organization's perspective, how a team member's adapted to this new work environment? So what are you trying to accomplish, and making sure that's very stated before that performance review begins. Another tip is making sure to allow a team member to reflect on their performance and kind of what we call a self-assessment. And that can be, again, how they're doing as much as what they're doing. So what did I accomplish, but what were my challenges, and what were some of the things that I've had difficulty coping with as we've moved to the new environment. Maintaining consistency and approach, making sure that the reviews that you do are consistent across different team members, and also making sure to show empathy, because we know that folks have different individual circumstances in terms of perhaps having more at-risk people in their household, which has changed the needs that they have, or different family circumstances. It doesn't change the work that they need to get done, but it is important to understand and have empathy for that. Final two tips. One is including a discussion on future development, and maybe being sure to celebrate your high performers and understand what opportunities they may have going forward. And then reinforcing the messaging you have in your performance review as you do your future check-in. So again, this is not a one and done type of thing, but it's something where there should be a feedback loop that goes on throughout the year and not just at the performance evaluation. So a couple of just tips in there. Again, many of these things are things you should be doing whether they're being done virtually or face-to-face, but they're good things to reflect on, and perhaps more important when you're thinking about doing virtual performance reviews when you're actually able to sit down with somebody. You know, David, again, over to you in terms of some of the things that you've observed. And I don't know if you've gone through a performance cycle during COVID or preparing for one, but clearly this can be a challenging subject.
Yeah, and you've made a great point about having the conversations throughout the year. You never want staff to be surprised at anything that comes out at an annual performance review if you're just doing performance reviews annually. And that is how we do them. Our performance, our merit increases are linked to the scores on the performance reviews. And obviously, that's the best practice for us, but it's not necessarily the best practice for your organization, but that's just the way that we do them. But everyone's reviews and goals are linked to CCF's purpose and values and the foundation's strategic goals. And our fiscal year ended on June 30th, so we've just completed our annual performance review and goal setting process this summer. We use an online performance management system. It's called TrackStar. We've used it for the past 2 years, but there are a lot of options out there. And of course, you can just use a template in Word as well. And that's what we were doing prior to a couple of years ago. One thing that we did have to do, though, is adjust some of the goals and objectives, because many of those goals were set up a year ago, more than a year ago, and so much has changed. So adaptability and flexibility is the key, and those areas were adjusted or removed on the review prior to the scoring. And we do use a self-assessment, so each staff member has an opportunity to complete their self-assessment and score in all of the different areas, values, competencies, and goals, and then the manager scores the review. And so this year, we followed that process. TrackStar is online, so we did that online, but each manager set up a time to have a virtual meeting to go over the review with the team member, you know, and prior to the team member actually seeing that review, they just kind of went over it in real time. And so it was really all virtual. And at the same time, the manager also delivers the goals for this fiscal year. So it went rather smoothly. Scott?
It's great to have a system in place like that. Again, whether it's an actual online tool or a process that maybe doesn't leverage technology as much. I think the important thing of what you mentioned there is consistency and making sure that managers or supervisors are following a consistent approach across all their team members and across the organization. As you said, there are a lot of different ways to do it. There's been a lot of controversy about, you know, actual ratings and rankings and different things, but feedback and quite frankly, reviewing performance remains a very important aspect of management and culture. So having some consistency across those tools is particularly important. Let's move on to the area where I know we have a question and an area of great challenge. And I will say that I think one of the resources that I looked at in terms of thinking about virtual interviews, hiring and onboarding there's some great resources on SHRM, SHRM, the website of the Society for Human Resource Management. There's also been some good articles written recently about how to adapt these processes to virtual. In fact, it was one thing that many organizations were already starting, was more online interviews and virtual interviews, just quite frankly, to streamline the process, to avoid certain types of biases, and also to reduce costs of having people travel in for lots of in-person interviews. So I think whether or not we get through the pandemic, the notion of some level of virtual interviewing, whether it's an initial screening or otherwise, are here to stay. But I think one of the biggest challenges that organizations have struggled with virtual is finding ways to highlight their culture and atmosphere, right? It's one thing to have somebody walk into the office and see what are the kind of people that work here, and what's the office look like, and how do people act. You're not going to get that in a virtual interview, so you have to find ways to highlight that and make it come through in a virtual interview. It may need more explicit description than you would need if you were bringing somebody into the office. The other thing is just making sure you're setting clear expectations about the process and how it's going to work. Making sure the technology works, and that there's an understanding that these interviews are going to be handled virtually and not in person. So there's just, I think, the need to be more explicit about things when doing a virtual interview than you might have in other cases. Why don't we pause there? And I know you've got some experience with this, David, in terms of how you guys have done it. And I'd love to hear about that and maybe get to the question before we talk about the broader onboarding processes.
Sure. And Scott, thank you for giving a shout out to SHRM. I've been involved with SHRM for the past few years and certified through SHRM, and also the local chapter, which is Palmetto SHRM. It's a great organization, and the national SHRM website does have a lot of great resources. CCF has onboarded 4 new staff members since March, since the pandemic. And most of those interviews have been conducted with GoToMeeting, which is similar to Zoom. 2 of those 4 staff members were hired without having gone through an in-person interview. So it is possible to go through the entire interview process virtually. Obviously, in a perfect situation, I would prefer having at least 1 in-person interview, but we hired a couple of great team members without even doing the in-person interview. So that's worked really well for us. We use a structured interview process. The questions are determined in advance, and we have a group of team members who are not always part of that department. So we try to involve various departments. And so typically 2 to 3 interviews before being hired. And really, it's just so important to have that process where you're sharing your culture. One of the basic ways to do it is through our job description. And before the pandemic, our job descriptions were just very basic, just job duties and job requirements. But Abigail Darlington, who's our communications officer, actually added a couple of different sections within our job descriptions that we post now, and it talks a lot about our culture and our values and what it's like to work at CCF and why I work for CCF. And there's also a separate section discussing our commitment to diversity and inclusion and what we do specifically in those areas. So we think that's really helped just at that process as someone is applying to kind of get an idea of what our culture is. And then during the interview, with involving other team members, we share kind of a day in the life of what we do and what it's like here in the office when we do get back to the office, but also what it's like in this remote situation. Scott?
No, those are great examples of bringing culture to the fore. I think the notion of cross-team interviewing is really important too, because you're not just joining the accounting department or the development office. You're joining an organization and wanting to understand how those different groups come together to fulfill purpose. We've been hearing a lot about how employees and team members are really want to be part of an organization that's making a difference, and that can really come through in those cross-team types of interviews that you're getting. So I think those are some great real-life examples. And Laura, I think we had a question here, or maybe it's time to hear that one.
Sure. You somewhat answered the question. The question is, any specific suggestions on best practices for virtually interviewing candidates? And I think David made the point about even before you get to the virtual interview, making sure that the job description is really clearly defined and that it also mentions the culture of the workplace. And the second suggestion that you just reinforced, Scott, that David made was about having multiple people from different teams and departments participate in the virtual interview process. Do you guys have other specific suggestions as the best practices that you could maybe share?
One other thing I might mention is, leveraging some other forms of technology. So many organizations will have things on their website about, careers or purpose or things. But when you get to the point and you've screened somebody and you want to have an interview with them, there may be some things you want to share that are more specific. So maybe a message from your executive director or CEO that talks a little bit about the organization, but some different things that you might offer up prior to the interview that could plant the seeds of those cultural aspects of your organization, and using some different formats for that would be one other thing that I've seen some organizations do to help prep for the interview and bring somebody in with a sense of what you're trying to accomplish.
Great. David?
No, that was a great point. Great point, Scott.
So I know we're coming up against the top of the hour here pretty soon. So let's get to the last topic, and we wanted to talk a little bit about onboarding. And David, you kind of touched on it a little bit in terms of saying you've brought some people in, and this is one kind of close to my heart because my daughter-in-law started a job without ever going into the office, and so went through the process of having a computer sent to her and being introduced to team members in a Zoom meeting as opposed to in person. So this is happening all the time. And again, most of the principles of onboarding in a virtual environment are the same as they are in person, but just amplified. So first thing I would say is onboarding is not a one and done. It's not like you have a one-day orientation session and you can expect that people are fully onboarded. It's a process that probably takes a good amount of time before someone is fully assimilated into your organization and culture. In a virtual environment, it's important to leverage technology. This is a place where video probably is really important, so that people are meeting people and seeing their faces, not just being introduced virtually or through email. The other thing is when it comes to technology, making use of things like shared screens so that you can have a technology person walk them through certain aspects of your technology and how to make sure everything's loaded up on whatever devices that you're using, but make that interactive and not just, reading through a paper guide or a how-to. We mentioned before about remote work policies and guidance. So that's really important with a new employee to understand what are the expectations given that they're working remotely in terms of hours and check-ins and the transparency around tasks that we talked about. And then the final thing, and we kind of covered that in the interview, but making introductions across teams so that they don't only understand the silo that they're sitting in, but really understand the other folks that they may be interacting with informally or formally in terms of team members. And again, that can be done with video. It can be done over time. It doesn't all have to be, in that first day where they've got to remember 35 names all at once, but that can be part of that ongoing process. So again, David, you're living through this right now and you probably have a couple things to add or some specific examples of what you've been doing in this area.
Sure, just real quick, just two quick things. So of the 4 team members we brought in, even though 2 of them went through the interview process completely remotely, all of them came in for an initial one-day orientation so they could at least meet a few people. Of course, not everyone was here, but they were able to meet with me and their supervisor. And in some cases, one of the VPs came in to meet with them. So we did have an all-day orientation. And then their manager also creates a schedule for the first couple of weeks on what they're going to be trained on and who they're going to meet initially. But in a perfect world, they would, at some point in the first couple of months, meet with everyone so that they have an understanding for what all of their colleagues do, or at least meet with the different departments. So that's really the most important thing that we did for those new staffers.
Great. With doing the in-person one day gets a chance for them to meet you with a mask on, and then doing videos with a mask off, I guess, right? So that's right. One of the other funny things about our current environment. So, Laura, any other questions or other things before we wrap up?
No, I will just add that first and foremost, thank you, Scott. Thank you, David. It really was a great learning experience for me, and I hope it was for everyone who joined us today. I'm grateful for your time and expertise. This session was recorded, and I will share the recording as well as the presentation and links to the DISC profile and maybe Trackstar. David, we can put that information in as well. So you guys will have all of that and can certainly share it. If you do have questions, please reach out to me and I can send the questions forward and get you the answers from the experts, Scott and David. And lastly, please take the survey so that we can get your feedback and make sure that we're continuing to provide content that you, nonprofit leaders and your boards and staff, are most interested in us addressing and bringing experts into. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you again, David Galvin and Scott Olson. I hope that everyone has a great day with time for being outside, stretching, not having video fatigue, maybe speaking to a colleague by phone and incorporating some of the great ideas that were shared with us today. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.